Hi, my name is Magnar Nordahl. I'm a captain and instructor on ATR aircraft. When flying with new first officers, I have noticed that many of them face the same challenges. For many pilots, ATR 42 or 72 is their first airline job, which means this is their first experience with complex systems, performance, and standard operating procedures. Therefore, it is understandable that some skills must be developed from scratch. Experience can only be acquired through practice, and there are no shortcuts here. A typewriting course is very intensive and requires the pilot to absorb a lot of knowledge. You will only get time to brief when you have passed the skill test. Then, in most cases, follows base training consisting of 6 takeoffs and landings. Then comes a well-deserved break when you wait for your typewriting to be entered into your license. Does that mean that you can have a vacation? Absolutely not. Because when you start your line training, or initial operational experience, as it also is called, you are supposed to know your aircraft and the procedures, all of them. The good news about line training is that you have more time for your preparations, and the flights can be pretty mundane. But there are new challenges, especially the paperwork. And you are now in a real world with other traffic, air traffic control, and different weather. And of course, you are responsible for the safety of cabin crew, ground crew, passengers, and cargo. Based on my personal experience, here are the top 10 mistakes in order of execution made by new first officers flying ATR 42 and 72. The cockpit preparation for ATR 72-600 requires the flight crew, mainly the first officer, to check more than 120 items. While the first officer is doing those checks, the captain will do the walk-around. Therefore, the responsibility is resting on the first officer's shoulders. But I have seen first officers skipping this checklist. Maybe they feel time pressure, but being short of time shall never compromise the safety. The taxi checklist, for example, has only 4 items, but we read it every time, and there's a reason for it. If you think you can do the cockpit preparation by memory 100% correct every single time, you must be a robot. But we are humans, and the checklists are there for our safety. Furthermore, it's always better to discover a technical problem before you start the flight. A lot of things happen before takeoff and after landing, but you must remember that when the gust lock is off, you are the only one who protects the flight controls against potential damage in wind gusts. Especially the ailerons are vulnerable. If you have experience from larger aircraft with hydraulic actuators, you might forget this important item. ATR aircraft are fly-by-wire, and I'm talking about the first generation metal wires. Surprisingly, many have problems with this. I don't know why, because you use the same technique as in a Cessna 172. Maybe some pilots never learned to fly in crosswind at the flight school. The ailerons are held into the wind when you are on the runway. Period. And one more thing, the control column is not a steering wheel like in a car. Whatever you do, never ever apply aileron for directional control. This can result in loss of control. Having a long wing mounted high up, the ATR is very sensitive to crosswind, and correct use of ailerons and rudder is essential. Sometimes I think pilots without a driver's license will manage this better. Positive climb, gear up, autopilot on. Yes, you can engage the autopilot when passing 100 feet after takeoff. But should you do it? That's another question. If you never fly the aircraft manually, you will never get the feel of the aircraft. And that can be important when you have to land in less than perfect conditions. I have experience to fly manually for a prolonged time and the autopilot for some reason didn't work. This should not be a challenge. The trust in automation has gone so far that Airbus some years ago issued a memo encouraging pilots to fly manually when the conditions allowed for it, for example good weather and low workload. As an absolute minimum, I recommend to hand fly the aircraft until it's established in normal climb. Then you will be familiar with the behavior of the aircraft as the speed changes and the flaps is retracted. Ask yourself the following. If the autopilot and the flight director fail shortly after takeoff, can I handle it? Some pilots are not conscious about the setting of the navigation display. When you are flying more or less straight ahead, you don't need rose mode. Arc mode doubles the area on the screen, and you should not set 5 miles range for takeoff or landing, because that gives you no time to react to threats like thunderstorms. For departure and approach, I usually use 20 miles range. In a few cases, I use 10 miles if the picture is cluttered. For example, when on final approach, it's always nice to see the weather in the area you have planned to fly your missed approach. Because if you see a big thunderstorm in that area, you can inform ATC that you want a different missed approach procedure. Some inexperienced pilots react late when thunderstorms appear ahead of them. But when you are pilot flying, you are responsible for the flight path. There should be no reason for the captain to interfere. The earlier you decide to deviate around a thunderstorm, the shorter the deviation, the shorter the time, and less fuel is burned. And please don't forget that the weather radar detects water, not turbulence, not clouds. The clouds are generally much larger than what is shown on the radar. Just compare what you see through the windscreen with the image on the radar, and you will know what I'm talking about. This is a big issue for many, and here is what's happening. On final approach, on the glide slope, the procedure is to stabilize the speed at 170 knots, at about 2,200 to 2,500 feet above the runway. We select flight idle and select flap 15. Then follows the landing gear. At 140 knots, you select flap 30. Those are the values for ATR 72. ATR 42 is initially flown at 160 knots and has different flap settings. When the flaps is in landing position, we do the before landing checklist. However, at the very same time, the speed is decreasing rapidly. And if you react late, you will certainly be at your approach speed 1,000 feet above the runway. Your reaction is to add power, and very often you add a lot of it. But unless this excess power is adjusted, the aircraft will accelerate steadily towards the runway. It's not uncommon to see the speed be more than 10 knots above approach speed. The solution is simple. As soon as landing flaps is set, you add power gradually, maybe 15% torque. This will control the speed much better. Your target should be V approach plus 10 or 15, depending on company policy for stabilized approach, at 1,000 feet above the runway. Another factor is that the air doesn't stand still. It moves in all directions, creating up and down drafts, and therefore you have to change the power on the final. It's not a fixed value. That only happens in the sim. And you should have the approach when passing the threshold at 50 feet. Many new first officers tend to aim for the right edge of the runway. Their intention is to put the nozzle on the center line, and therefore they want to be a little offset because they're sitting on the right side. But instead they will end up on putting the right hand main gear in the grass. And when they detect this error, it's already very late and they start to throw the aircraft around in the air as they are crossing the threshold. My advice is to put yourself on the center line. You sit on the center line. By doing this, you will miss the center line this much. It's easy to do. And one more thing. When you disconnect autopilot, don't change your heading. The aircraft is already on correct track. But in a crosswind, you will have a crab, and that might give you the impression that you will go off the runway. Therefore, wait for a couple of seconds and make only corrections if you are drifting off the center line. The aircraft doesn't land exactly like the simulator. FCOM, Pro, NOP, ANOR 1.3 and 8.2 give the main rules. And I would like to add the following. 1. The ATR is landed like an airliner, not a Cessna 172. Yes, you use the ailerons like in a Cessna, but you don't land it like a Cessna with a long flare. The flare should only reduce the rate of descent. You should not float. And just as you touch down, you lower the nose a couple of degrees. This is how the auto landing works in the airliners. If you do that, lower the nose a split second before you touch down, the landing will be very smooth. And while you flare, you reduce power gradually. You should have flight idle at touchdown. Then you let the nose come down to the ground. Then you move the control column forward to give maximum directional control. And while doing all that, you use ailerons and rudder as required to stay on the center line, and you're going down the center line. Any crab is removed during the flare. And once you have landed, you must not delay moving the power levers into ground idle. The propeller blades are very effective air brakes, especially when you move the power levers towards reverse. Just placing the power levers on top of the reverse band is very effective, especially above 70 knots. All that said, can you guess number 1 on the list? This one might surprise you. Every 6 months do we do recurrent training in a simulator. And guess what? The first recurrent training for a new first officer is always a big eye-opener. It's like, what? Have I forgotten all that? You can brief procedure for engine failure every day you're flying, but when it's time to do it, you are a bit lost because you haven't done it for the last 6 months. Most pilots never experience engine flame at a takeoff. I know nobody. And then there are all the other emergency procedures you are supposed to know by heart. Fire, smoke, emergency descent, pilot incapacitation, etc. How well do you remember them? My advice is to repeat the procedure on a regular basis when you're flying, because you never know when you will need them. Okay, that's all for this time. Please support my channel by sharing with your friends and all that. Thank you for watching, have a wonderful day and happy landing!